Hi, I'm Hannon, the host of The Bells I Hear, an audio and video podcast by Mentor Promise that aims to raise awareness about the homelessness crisis in New York City. We'll be diving into the complexities surrounding the issue. Thanks for tuning in. Today we have Quinn joining us. She serves as president and CEO of WIN, Women in Need, the largest nonprofit dedicated to providing shelter and supportive housing for homeless women and children. You have a very remarkable career. As part of the city council from 1999 to 2013, you were at the forefront of history in the city of New York. And in 2013, you were recognized by Crain's as one of the 50 most powerful women in New York, which is incredible. Crain's New York is a very respected weekly newspaper, and so that must have been quite the honor. Clearly, people love you in the city. You're the perfect person to ask this question. We know homelessness is a very urgent issue, and it is worsening over time. And so, if you had the power to make a change, what is one action that, you would take to address this very complex and large issue?
One of the things most New Yorkers don't know is that the vast majority of homeless people are families with children. 68% of the people in shelter right now are families with children. So I would want New Yorkers to know that, because if you don't know that, you can't push your electeds for policies that are going to address that. Now, we know that when people are in shelter, if we help them move out of shelter with subsidies, housing vouchers, they're called, which pay about 70% of the rent, then the person pays 30%. And you can get these vouchers as long as you need to, as long as you're in that a lower economic state. And when you don't need them anymore, then you won't get them. We know that when people exit shelter with a voucher, 0.03% return to shelter, as opposed to when people leave without a subsidy, 15% return to shelter. And one of the reasons we are at the highest point we're at right now is because people are coming back to shelter, because they're not leaving in a truly supported, substantial way. So if I could wave a magic wand, I would expand the voucher program. I would offer vouchers to undocumented people, not just the migrants we've seen recently, but all of the undocumented people in shelter. I would also make the voucher system more efficient. We hear from landlords all the time, particularly small and medium-sized landlords. We want to take folks who have vouchers. It's a steady income. But the way the city administers them is so delinquent and so inefficient. They are on a smaller rent roll than like a big developer. They just have trouble risking it. So those are the other thing I would do is, when you're a homeless family, you have to go to intake in the Bronx. There's only one intake center in the Bronx. And you are not met by somebody with a name tag that says, "Hi, I'm Chris. I'm here to help you. I'm your social worker." You're met by somebody who's called a fraud investigator. And their job is to determine that you're not homeless and that the city isn't legally obligated to house you. Now, you've ended up there because you've been evicted or you've been the victim of domestic or sexual violence. So what we do is put you through another trauma of forcing you to show documentation, and you had been living with your aunt and her family, and now you aren't. Well, doesn't your aunt love you? Let's call her. Let's see if she can take you. We need to stop judging people who are homeless as bad people and start working together.
100%. You had mentioned that 0.03% of people will return back to shelters.
Well, if they have a voucher. If they don't have a voucher, it can be as high as 15%.
15%. And you're saying that they aren't provided with adequate and substantial support after leaving the shelter system. Could you expand a little bit more on the kind of support that they would need to thrive?
Right. So what they first need is to be able to pay the rent, first and foremost. So they need to have a voucher or some type of subsidy. Maybe they're moving into housing authority, but those are few and far between, those units that are available. So we need to make sure people exit with a plan where they have a voucher and they have the ability to pay the rent and they don't get re-evicted. Two, we need to make sure those folks who are able to work are not just working, but are working in a job that pays a living wage. Leaving shelter, even with a voucher and working in McDonald's, you're not going to be able to sustain independent living for your family. At Wynn, mostly with private money, we run something called an income building program. And that program uh, not just does resume writing and how to do an interview, that's all important, don't get me wrong, but it does extensive and diverse trainings targeted towards sectors where our moms have interest and where there are job vacancies and job growths. Over half of our moms leave with a good paying job. That really raises the likelihood that they're going to be able to thrive independently. Now, 30 to 40% of moms leaving shelter will need a little extra help. And you know what? There's lots of us who are housed who need a little extra help. We just have the resources to get, therapy or a nanny or whatever. These folks do best if they move into what's called supportive housing. It's permanent housing with services on site, case management, psychiatric social workers, people who are going to help you with your medicines. We need to build more supportive housing in our communities so folks who maybe have had a mental health issue or a substance misuse issue or, a very, very traumatic history of domestic violence or a child, young woman, aging out of foster care who has a baby. The supportive housing model can really help folks. And it's permanent. You can stay there as long as you want, or if you no longer feel like you need the help, you can move somewhere else. And that's a model that we need to deepen the city and state's commitment to.
It sounds like a very amazing resource, especially if you are just, leaving the shelter system, but you still need that support from, all these different services. So,
and it's very, they're very in the community. And one of the things I wish we did, when people leave shelter, but we don't do, is it probably needs a better name, but is aftercare, right? So I don't know, is it 3 months, is it 6 months, is it 9 months, is it 12 months? We need to figure that piece out. But, you may have gone from your childhood home to a partner's home where that partner is a batterer. And one of the ways that people act out domestic violence is also financial. They won't let you have your own checking account. They run up credit card debt in your name. So you may get to shelter and never have the experience where you had to pay bills or run a household budget. If we were working with folks in those few months after shelter, we teach financial literacy, but it's one thing to learn it in a classroom and then to apply it. If we were doing that in aftercare, if we were connecting people to the local child care that would take a child care voucher, if we were connecting folks to the Little League or the settlement house or, whatever, that would reduce people coming back. And doing these things, yes, they cost taxpayer money, but they cost far less money than if somebody comes back to shelter. And in the aftercare model, I would have a group like Wynn involved, but I would really have it be led by a neighborhood group, like the local settlement house, so the folks really begin to feel connected to their new neighborhood.
I did also want to touch on something that you mentioned earlier about the rhetoric of homeless people. I was wondering if you could just expand more on that and I don't know, how we can sort of reframe our minds in the way that we sort of think about homeless people, because, it has been said that you are just one paycheck away from homelessness yourself. You're one emergency away from homelessness. And so how do you think we can go about, rewriting the narrative?
Sometimes we talk about our families as the forgotten face of homelessness. Because really the face, and I don't want to say that single people don't need more support. They do. But the actual face of homelessness in New York City is a 5-year-old child. The average length of stay at Wynn is 11 months. So let's just say a year. So children could be spending a quarter, basically, of their lives in shelter. Now, I don't think anybody should protest against homeless people, singles, families, whatever. But how do you hold up placards against a child who is in need of help? We did a ad campaign once at Wynn where we basically just had, a picture of a mom on the subway with her child, picture of mom on a park bench, picture of mom leaving the supermarket. And, our message was, you could be sitting next to a homeless person. You just don't know it. Yeah. Right. And we need to learn who homeless people are, understand why they're homeless, and stop this judgment and feeling like we're superior. You know, we have city workers living in our shelter. It is hard to find a place you can live on less than a big salary in New York. So if you, like you said, you have one sickness where you have a big deductible, if you get a divorce, if somebody dies. You know, we had a family where the family had been living in Florida pretty well and stably, and the mom, grandma, got sick. So they moved to New York to take care of her, and they were taking care of her and working. And she had, an apartment, and when she died, they had to move out. But they didn't have the resources, to immediately find an apartment. Life happens. Yeah. And we're all, lucky, those of us who are housed, that it hasn't happened to us in that kind of a way. And I have to say, we see such brilliance among our moms. I mean, they are the most resilient, hardworking people. And when we had the beginning of the influx of migrants to our shelters, we had a mom who in one of our shelters got a box, went into her closet. Now, how many clothes could she have in her closet in shelter, right? Took out the clothes she didn't need, went door to door in the shelter asking her neighbors for the clothes they didn't need, and then put the box in the lobby with a little note on it that said, "To our new neighbors." I mean, that's the kind of spirit and soul you see from folks. And, these moms, they don't have time to pull the covers over their head. You know what I mean? They're out there every day fighting for themselves and for their children.
Wow.
And this vision that people are going into shelter just to get housing. Well, why else would you go into shelter? But you know what I mean? Like it's some kind of a scam.
Right.
Look, Quinn runs a great shelter. No question. But I wouldn't want to live there. There's curfews. You can't have visitors, except for pre-approved ones in the community room. You're not allowed by city rules to even hang up a poster in the room. So you're living in a very structured situation that's, even though we try to make it as soft and wonderful as possible, it's still institutional. Nobody wants to live like that.
Right.
You have to get a pass to, spend the weekend at your mother's house or whatever.
Yeah, it's beautiful to see even just like the compassion and care amongst, people in shelters.
Yeah, we'll see that, because we run daycares in all of our shelters, but they're from 8 to 6. And so usually when moms are starting out, like anybody who's lower on the totem pole at work, they'll, have the worst shifts. So, you have to get it approved, but you'll see moms who say, well, drop them off at my unit, I'll take care of them, and then I'll bring them to daycare, et cetera. There's a real team sense to it.
Yeah.
My favorite story is I was visiting one of our permanent supportive housings in the Bronx, and I was having a meeting with all these tenants, and we were just kind of having a conversation, and the conversation somehow went to issue of prisons. There was a woman there who had been a corrections officer. She had been injured on the job. And then it ends up a woman disclosed that she had been incarcerated herself. And at the end of the meeting, I saw the former corrections officer and the former incarcerated person talking to each other, making a date to go to a meeting at the Women's Prisons Association the next week to advocate for female prisoners. It was like, wow, community can happen and bloom in the most unexpected places.
That's amazing. On the note of shelters or just housing in general in New York City and the lack thereof, recently the New York City Council held a marathon hearing for City of Yes. And for those of you who may not be aware, City of Yes aims to provide New Yorkers with more housing in every neighborhood, just to provide opportunities in addition to bringing housing costs down. We wanted to get your thoughts on City of Yes, and do you think it will create more housing for families in shelters?
I think the City of Yes was a great step forward. I think it was bold and brave of Mayor Adams and of the City Council. We all love our low-rise, very charming neighborhoods, ones that have real character. And we want to preserve that. But we also want to make sure that we're a city where people of all different economic incomes can live and thrive. We cannot allow New York to remain a city of the very rich and the very, very poor, or someday just the very rich. Now, there's give and take always if you're trying to meet multiple goals. And I think the city of Yes balanced that. It's protecting the integrity of our neighborhoods while also creating the opportunity to build more housing. And when people rally against homeless shelters, sometimes they say shelters aren't the answer, housing is the answer. And they're right. They're 100% right. But the city of Yes passes, it's not like the next day there's 10,000 new units, right? But if you don't have the city of Yes and you don't have buildings going on, there won't be any place for folks to be. And I think the city of Yes was also thoughtful in the sense of making sure that not all of the apartments that get built are studios, right? Because that happens sometimes. And that doesn't really meet the diversity of need that we have in the city.
City of Yes is kind of providing like this foundation
Absolutely.
to work off of.
A roadmap, if you will.
A roadmap, yeah. You seem very passionate about the issue of homelessness. Do you have personal experience with homelessness, or I guess what sort of drew you to the work specifically?
I've never experienced homelessness myself, or actually had a family member who did. I was lucky enough when in my time in the city council to meet great advocates for homeless people who gave me the opportunity to meet and work with people who were homeless. And it just was a lot of it happened also in the context of HIV/AIDS, and it's now called the HIV/AIDS Service Agency. It used to be called the Division of AIDS Services, and I worked with a lot of homeless people who in the 90s who were dealing with HIV and AIDS. And you're reminded that life is very fragile. And you're reminded that if you're in a position to help somebody who is in that state of being fragile, you just have to take that opportunity and help them. My late mother was, I went to Catholic school for 12 years, and there's a lot you can say bad about Catholics, which I have. But there's also a lot good you can say. There's a real framework of being of service, of giving back, of helping those in need. And my mother was very kind of devoted to the Beatitudes and the sense of giving back, and I think she infused that into myself and my sister.
I guess what has continued to sort of give you hope, especially, as the numbers of student homelessness has increased, the lack of affordable housing has increased. What has sort of given you hope to continue going and keep fighting for?
We sent 50 WIN kids to college last year. 50 kids left shelter and went to college. Now, they went to college with sheets and comforters and a bathrobe and a shower caddy and a this and a that, because WIN was able to get the Real Simple magazine and all these other folks to donate brand new items for them. I mean, if that doesn't give you hope for the future, I don't know what does. And at WIN, we run a camp every school break and every summer. And it's a STEM-based camp, and I went to visit camp once, and a little boy the kids were playing with Legos. And I said to the little boy, "Oh, you're playing with Legos." And he put his hand on his hip, and he looked at me, and he said, "I'm engineering." And that gives you hope. You know what I mean? That little boy in the basement of a shelter in a room that's a little ratty, if I'm going to be honest, has donated Legos and sees himself as an engineer. Those kind of things, give you hope. When President Trump tried to freeze all that federal money, I mean, the whole country rose up. And he was pushed back in less than 24 hours. So I'm under no illusion that we're going to win every battle. I don't even think we're going to be able to fight every battle. But I do believe that we can, when we fight together, be successful, and we should be heartened by that success.
It's honestly the little things and also the big things that should keep us going. What is something your work in politics has taught you about homelessness that you would like others to know?
That it's solvable. That we can get out of this crisis. We may never have no homeless people in this city, but we can get out of this crisis state if we work together and if we're honest. And the other thing it's taught me is that it could take 10 to 15 years. And you got to be honest with New Yorkers about that. And they will understand that. I've also learned that today's opponent to a homeless shelter, today's person who's saying unkind things, tomorrow could be volunteering in the shelter. And we've seen that time and again. When we opened the Audre Lorde family residence on Staten Island, they were not happy. They were not happy. You know, we had police at the community meeting to keep things calm. And most recently, the paper out on Staten Island wrote an article about how all of the fears never came to fruition. And the only criticism they had was that we had not done nice landscaping in front of the building and in our flower beds, which is a fair criticism. The trees we wanted to buy were a little expensive, but in response to that article, the St. George's Beautification Committee has reached out and we're fixing up the tree pits with flowers. So, you know, today's enemy, and I think this is a message we need to get in politics in general. We need to take down the rhetoric. We need to remember we're talking about human beings who've had all kinds of experiences, and we need to remember that today's enemy could be tomorrow's friend, and compromise isn't a dirty word. I mean, look, no one was more progressive than Ted Kennedy, right? And when he had his final medical incident and they had to take him out, it was actually at the lunch after President Obama's inauguration. The two senators, or one of the senators who jumped in the ambulance with him, was a Republican. Some of his best, some of my best friends, but some of his best friends were Republicans. And if we could work together in whatever moment we're in, I think that's a good lesson to understand and live by.
Completely. People will always come around. It seems
Absolutely.
like they just need a little bit of exposure or just time.
It's much harder. It's much easier to hate someone you don't know.
Yeah.
It's very hard to look somebody in the eye. I mean, look, there are evil people who do it, and people have done it with me on LGBT issues, but it's much harder to look somebody in the eye and treat them like dirt.
And, you know, you clearly have had a long career in politics. Curious to hear about what drew you to transitioning to, you know, leading a nonprofit like Win.
Well, you know, when I lost the mayor's race and was term limited out and leading government, I knew I wanted to work for a nonprofit organization. I wanted to work on an issue that had an urban focus. I wanted to work on an issue that had a women's focus, and I wanted to work on an issue that did both social service and advocacy. Because I think if you do advocacy without also doing direct service, you sometimes are a little hollow in what you're doing because it's too ivory tower. It's not directly from those who are impacted. And delivering just social service is God's work, but I need the advocacy. You know what I mean? I love doing that piece of it. Now, at any given time, there's none of those jobs available. And I'm lucky enough, you know, that was in a situation where I could take my time to find a job because my wife is working. And so when Win came up, so I had gotten a fellowship to the Institute of Politics at the Kennedy School, and I was up in Boston, and I got a call from someone who had gotten a call from a headhunter about the job at Win, and they kind of checked. They didn't have a huge advocacy program there, but they indicated they wanted to build one. It was from March until September, and so it fit the bill. It was what I wanted to do. I knew very clearly what I didn't want to do. I didn't want to lobby. I didn't want to go into the business world. You know, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not an accountant, I don't have any, you know, those kind of skills, so to speak.
It seems like Win was like the perfect opportunity.
Perfect.
In your way.
Yeah.
And, you know, based on the title, it seems, you know, it's one can insinuate that Win only provides, you know, resources to women, but it actually provides resources to, you know, families and students.
92% of our households are headed by women, single women, but we do have single dads. We have families with two partners. You know, that's just the origin of the name. When we were founded on Valentine's Day, about 41 years ago, our founder, Rita Zimmer, took a mom and her children into a church basement and started Win. So then it wasn't excluding men, but it was really all women. And we wanted to, you know, honor that early work, so kept the name. But we just started a men's mentoring group at one of our supportive housing places, and then the girls were like, wait a minute. So now we have a young women's mentoring group too, and you know, it's really, our focus is families.
Win does provide resources to students as well. That's something that Mentor Promise is also tackling, is, you know, providing students with educational resources, mentorship. You know, just curious to hear your thoughts on like how we can expedite housing for, you know, students and families within temporary housing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the City of Yes is going to be helpful in the long term. The idea of, getting vouchers to people more expansively and more quickly. Also, being more cognizant of helping folks find homes to live in that are near where they're going to school, that meet their educational needs. Also, the city council a few years ago created something called the Bridging the Gap social workers. So the public schools that have the most homeless kids, and there's a finite number of those, are supposed to have extra social workers who help the homeless children and their parents. That's a program that really should be deepened.
It seems like you would provide, students with
Exactly.
the resources and tools that they
Exactly.
need to thrive. Yeah.
Now, I will say CUNY is a great partner to us in our work around getting kids into school and getting extra training for moms. So they really deserve a shout out for their focus.
It seems like Wynn also has, a vision for the future. I know that you guys have launched Project Hope, which is
Yes.
an urgent call to address like harmful policy changes outlined in Project 2025, especially, as people anticipate aggressive changes with the rollout of this new administration. Can you talk a little bit
Sure.
about how Wynn is mobilizing through Project Hope to combat these changes and challenges that will be directly impacting, low-income individuals and also families experiencing homelessness?
So, although he denied, knowing anything about it, President Trump, during the presidential election, the Heritage Foundation, which is a very, very conservative think tank, put out Project 2025, which is a roadmap of draconian changes to the federal government's operations and their fundings that will directly hurt and impact homeless people, low income children, public schools, and the list kind of goes on and on. Now, we need to fight back on this. We need to try to prevent the federal government from doing these things. But we're not going to be able to stop all of it. We just need to be honest about that. And the author of it is now the head of the president's Office of Management and Budget. But if the federal government does perpetrate part or all of Project 2025, we as the city and the state have resources. We have agency. We can, fight back. And Project Hope 2025 outlines what the city and state can do if the federal government does something horrible or abandons any of our communities. And some of it has already been put in place. Governor Hochul in our State of the State called for a low-income tax credit. That would be a big help.
Yeah, it seems like there are going to be a lot of massive changes have already started happening.
Yeah.
And so it will, continue to impact, New Yorkers, also people, across the country. Could you, I guess, talk a little bit more about, with Project Hope, I guess, how can people in New York become more, engaged and also be a part of resolving, a lot of the big changes that are happening?
Well, one, they should go to our website, winnyc.org, and sign up to volunteer with Win, and we can integrate them into different stuff we're doing. Two, the best way to volunteer is usually at your neighborhood level, right? So find the local community group and get involved, and that's the best place. Also, we're lucky to have great civic groups in this city, Planned Parenthood, the National Institute of Reproductive Health, groups, places like the Lesbian and Gay, Bisexual, and Transgender Community Services Center. So we're really lucky in New York to have a lot of places where people can pitch in and join. And sometimes people think, well, I'm not a public speaker, I'm not a this, I'm not a that. Trust me, when you're doing political organizing, there is a need for everything. From, getting the flyers prepared to laying out the website to making telephone calls. Whatever your skill set is, there's a way to put it together. I was going to say stuffing the envelopes, but that just shows how old I am. We don't really do that anymore.
Yeah, it sounds like, we need all hands on deck.
All hands on deck.
Yeah. Moving on to just the migrant crisis here in New York City. It's clearly has become, a larger issue. What do you think are the most pressing challenges we are facing in providing support and resources to migrants?
So two. One is giving them the ability to get out of shelter, to get out of welfare hotels. You do that by offering them the housing vouchers that you offer to documented people. Two, and this is really on rush mode now because of President Trump, but people who have come here, many of them have the qualifications for asylum, for temporary protective status, for as long as we still have it, if they've been the witness or victim of the crime, for a U visa. Now, we saw this need at Wynn, and we partnered with the New York Legal Assistance Group and put together a housing clinic where we began to move people through this process. Because moving through this process will get you status, legal status, and get you work authorization. That is really critical, particularly as Trump is clawing back the avenues. We need to double down on legal representation for migrants.
If a current student is aspiring to work in public service and wanted to get involved in advocacy work, what steps would you recommend they take to get involved and start gaining experience in the field?
They should certainly feel free to reach out to me on the WIN website. I'm happy to talk to them. I love to talk to young people who want to do this work. They should do an internship with their local council member or Congress member or assembly member or state senator. That's a great way to learn, or even do an internship for the city council centrally down at City Hall. They should, I'm going to make the assumption they're a Democrat, they should join their local Democratic club or the Young Democrats, or, whatever they're interested in. If they're really interested in the environment, they should get involved with the League of Conservation Voters. If they're really interested in reproductive health, they should become a volunteer for Planned Parenthood or a clinic defender. They should figure out what their passion is, what their issue is, and then go chase that. And, people think like, oh, I don't want to bother him. I don't want to bother her. When somebody reaches out to you and says, can I get advice from you? It's a compliment. Who doesn't want to be thought of as somebody who has a lot of ability to share information, to give information? So people need to kind of reprogram that thought in their brain. It's not a bother.
Right. It's really about working together. And
absolutely. And it's a compliment that people think you have something worth sharing.
Yeah, 100%. Do you have specific advice for women or LGBTQ folks that are, interested in getting involved in political office?
Well, often those who have the ugliest things to say speak the most. So just because you're hearing off-putting things, to be kind in the description, don't think that's what the majority of people think. When I was running for speaker, when I was speaker, the first woman and the first LGBT person to be speaker, people would say to me, this was in 2005, you're not going to win. And you'd be like, okay, thanks. You're a woman, you're a lesbian, you're from the west side of Manhattan, which in that context was an insult, and you're not going to win. And less frequently did people say, you're going to win. But there were tons of people who thought I was going to win. And I just had to decide who I was going to listen to. And you have to kind of be prepared that there's going to be these naysayers. And they're often the people who are too afraid to risk anything themselves. And so instead of putting themselves out there, they tear you down. And if there is something about you that's different, they'll focus on that. So just be prepared for that. But never believe that is actually the majority of the voices. It's just sometimes the minority of the voices raise their voice the loudest.
Well, that's amazing advice. You should never let, those people hold you back from going after what you want. And yeah, that's a beautiful way to end this. Thank you so much.
Oh, great. Well, this was lovely. And if you ever want to have me back or somebody else from Win back, we would love that. So thank you for your service doing this podcast.
Thank you again for listening to The Bells I Hear. Subscribe to our podcast and follow Mentor Promise on social media for more. Special thanks to Alice Obar, our video and audio editor, Kia Alice, our researcher, scriptwriter, and content producer, and Baron Obamello, our producer.